I remember the morning air outside the ministry. It was sharp, biting, and carried that familiar urban cocktail of roasted coffee beans, wet asphalt, and the faint, metallic tang of car exhaust. It was a Tuesday, a day built for mundane tasks and small, forgettable achievements. I remember the rhythmic, confident sound of my own leather heels clicking against the pavement. It was a steady, purposeful tempo. At that moment, I was a man with a schedule. I was a man with a place in the world. In my right hand, I carried a slim, tan briefcase. I could feel the slight grain of the leather against my palm, the handle warmed by my own grip. Inside was a single document, a simple permit, something that should have required nothing more than a clerk's stamp and a few minutes of my life. It was a triviality, really. Just a small piece of the social contract that I expected to fulfill before my 11 o'clock meeting. When I reached the ministry, I pushed against the heavy, iron filigreed doors. They were colder than I expected, the kind of cold that bites through the fabric of your gloves and settles in your joints. As they swung open, the city behind me was instantly, violently severed. The roar of the morning traffic, the shouting of the news vendors, the frantic energy of 1,000 people in motion, it all vanished. The silence that replaced it was not an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was thick, pressurized, and felt like physical weight pressing against my eardrums, as if I had suddenly stepped off a cliff and into deep, stagnant water. I stood in the lobby, momentarily paralyzed by the scale of the room. It was a cathedral of bureaucracy. The vaulted ceilings were lost in a permanent, gray haze, supported by gargantuan pillars of veined marble. The marble wasn't white or cream. It was a bruised, sickly gray, cold even to look at. The air here didn't circulate. It sat. It was stagnant, smelling of lemon floor wax that had long since turned sour, ancient radiator steam, and the dry, suffocating dust of pulverized paper. It was the kind of air that didn't just touch your skin, it clung to it, coating the back of my throat with the chalky taste of a tomb. I took my place at the back of the line. 42 people. I remember the number because I spent the first hour doing nothing but counting them. I needed to count. I needed the arithmetic to anchor my mind to a reality that felt like it was beginning to thin out at the edges. 1, 2, 3. I studied the backs of their heads. I studied the charcoal suit of the man directly in front of me. I counted the 3 small buttons on his sleeves. I counted the faint, white pilling of the wool on his shoulders. I looked down at the floor. The marble was a map of decay. I followed the jagged, vein-like fissures in the tiles as they meandered under the feet of the people in front of me. They looked like root, or perhaps like lightning frozen in stone. I wondered how long it took for marble to crack like that. Decades? Centuries? I shook the thought away. It was just an old building. Tock, tock, tock. The grandfather clock near the elevators was the only pulse in the room. It was a deep, wooden strike, not a tick but the sound of bone hitting timber. Each interval felt slightly longer than the one before. It was as if the gears were grinding through thick, black honey, pulling time itself to a snapping point. I found myself waiting for the next strike, holding my breath until the wood groaned and the hammer fell. I looked at my watch. The silver casing caught the dim, overhead light. 10:15 a.m. I told myself to be patient. I was a civilized man. I knew how to wait. I focused on the rhythm of my own breathing, but soon, even that felt too loud, too intrusive in this pressurized space. I listened to the faint, rhythmic wheeze of a distant radiator, a metallic, rattling sound that resembled a labored, dying breath. I waited until the soles of my feet began to ache, a dull throb that vibrated in time with the clock. My mind began to wander, drifting back to the city outside. I thought about my office, my desk, the way the light would be hitting the glass paperweight near my computer at this exact time of day. I thought about the coffee I would buy afterward, black, hot, and bitter. These thoughts were my lifeline. They reminded me that I was a person who moved, a person who had a before and an after. "I'll be out of here by 10:30, I whispered to myself. My voice sounded thin, like tearing paper. It didn't echo. The room swallowed it instantly. I looked at my watch again, certain that at least 40 minutes had passed in that gray gloom. I expected to see the hands nearing 11. 10:17 a.m. A small, cold knot of confusion tightened in my chest. Only 2 minutes. That couldn't be right. I held the watch to my ear. The mechanical heartbeat was steady. Tick 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 tick. It was working. My watch was fine. It was the world in this lobby that didn't care about my watch. The realization arrived not as a shock, but as a slow, creeping chill that started at my ankles and crawled up my spine. The line had not moved a single inch. At the very front, perhaps 50 feet away, a woman in a floral print dress stood perfectly still before the teller's window. The glass of the window was frosted, a thick, opaque barrier that hid whatever sat on the other side. Above her, a neon sign hummed with a sickly, buzzing green light. It was the only vibrant color in the room, and it made the skin of everyone in line look jaundiced, almost sallow. Next customer. The sign pulsed, yet the woman didn't move. She didn't adjust her floral handbag. She didn't shift her weight. She simply stared into that frosted void, her reflection a pale, ghostly smear on the glass. I felt a strange sense of comfort in her stillness. I told myself it was just a slow morning. A shift change, perhaps. A technical glitch with the records. I had nowhere else to be, I told myself. My 11 o'clock meeting wasn't that important. I decided to wait. It felt like the responsible thing to do. The logical thing. After all, I was already 43rd in line. I had already invested the time. To leave now would be to admit defeat to a mere 2 minutes of waiting. I settled into the silence. I let the smell of the dust fill my lungs. I watched the bead of sweat on the man's neck in front of me, and I waited for the clock to strike again. I was certain the line would move any second now. I was absolutely certain. The second hand on my watch continued its relentless, circular march, but the atmosphere in the lobby began to feel like heavy silk, wrapping itself around my limbs, thickening with every breath I took. I noticed that the man in front of me, the one in the charcoal suit, had not adjusted his stance once. Not a single twitch of the shoulder, not a slight lean to the left. He was a pillar of gray wool, a statue carved from the very air of the ministry. It was then that I saw the first anomaly. It was small. So small that a younger, faster version of myself, a man still belonging to the city outside, would have missed it entirely. On the back of the man's neck, just above the yellowed, stiff collar of his shirt, there was a single, microscopic bead of sweat. I watched it with the intensity of a hawk. In the world outside, gravity would have claimed it in a second. It would have raced down the skin and vanished into the fabric. But here, the bead was struggling. It moved with the agonizing, glacial pace of a tectonic plate. I watched it for what felt like an hour, my eyes unblinking, and it hadn't even traveled a millimeter. It sat there, suspended in a state of impossible tension, glittering like a diamond under the sickly green hum of the neon sign. My mind began to offer me excuses. The air is too thick, I thought. Surface tension. The humidity in this tomb is playing tricks on my eyes. But as I stared at that bead of moisture, a deeper, more primal part of my brain began to whisper that the physics of this room were starting to detach from the physics of the street. The temperature began to dip. It wasn't a sudden frost, but a gradual withdrawal of warmth, as if the building itself were breathing in all the heat and refusing to breathe it back out. I felt the chill settle into the marrow of my shins, a dull, aching cold that made my bones feel brittle, like old glass. This is absurd, I thought. The voice in my head was sharp, trying to reassert control, trying to maintain the dignity of a man who had an 11 o'clock meeting. I am a man of logic. I am standing in a queue for a permit. The clerk is likely having a technical issue or a long lunch. Any moment now, the bell will ring, the line will surge, and I will be back in the sun. But even as I thought it, I didn't believe it. I reached into my pocket for my phone. I wanted to see the digital numbers. I wanted the cold, hard certainty of a satellite-synced clock. My fingers felt strangely numb, as if they were made of wood. It took a concentrated, agonizing effort to wrap my hand around the smooth glass of the device. I pulled it out. The screen flickered to life, the blue light blindingly bright in the twilight of the lobby. No service. That was expected. The walls were thick enough to stop a radio wave. But then I looked at the clock on the screen. 10:17 a.m. I stared at it. I held it up to my face. I looked at the silver watch on my wrist. Both were identical. Both claimed that only 2 minutes had passed since I arrived. I felt a sudden, hot flash of panic, the first real spark of fear. It was a physical sensation, a tightening of the throat, a frantic bird fluttering in my chest. I looked back at the doors. They were so close, just 20 feet of marble. I could see the golden, blurry movement of a taxi through the frosted glass inserts. I could see the shadow of a person walking a dog. They were moving at a speed that looked violent, impossible, like a film played at 10 times its natural pace. They were living in a different time. They were accelerating away from me. I took a half step backward, my heel making a sharp, ugly clack on the marble. For the first time, I saw a reaction. The man in the charcoal suit didn't turn his head, but his shoulders gave a tiny, dry creak, the sound of an old floorboard under pressure. He didn't speak, but I felt a wave of profound disapproval emanate from him. It was the heavy, silent weight of 42 people judging my impatience, 42 minds telling me that my movement was a vulgarity. To move is to forfeit. A voice seemed to echo in the hollow of my skull, though no one had spoken. I stopped. I pulled my foot back into its original position, fitting my heel perfectly into the indentation it had already begun to make in the floor. The silence rushed back in to fill the gap I had made, more suffocating than before. I began to doubt my own senses. Perhaps the lemon scent of the floor wax was hallucinogenic. Perhaps the lack of oxygen was making my brain misfire. I tried to remember the taste of my breakfast, but the memory was already becoming gray, like a sketch left out in the rain. I could remember that I ate, but I couldn't remember the flavor of the bread or the temperature of the tea. I looked at the woman in the floral dress at the very front. A spider had begun to weave a web between the handle of her handbag and the brass railing of the counter. It moved with a methodical, horrifying speed, its 8 legs dancing in the green light. It wasn't waiting for a fly. It was weaving the woman into the furniture, and she didn't move. She didn't blink. I realized then that the strangeness wasn't a glitch. It was a feature. The line wasn't just slow, it was deliberate. It was testing the density of my soul. I felt a strange, terrifying curiosity. What would happen if I stayed for 1 more minute? What would the watch say then? I put the phone back in my pocket. I straightened my tie with trembling fingers. I decided, with a calm that should have frightened me, that I would wait until 10:20. Just 3 more minutes of my life. It seemed like a fair trade for the truth. The 3 minutes I had promised myself, that narrow window between 10:17 and 10:20, did not pass. They expanded. They became a vast, gray ocean of seconds, and I was forced to tread its heavy waters while my limbs grew increasingly leaden. I began to notice a new sound. It wasn't the clock, and it wasn't the radiator. It was a wet, heavy friction, a rhythmic dragging noise coming from the very front of the line. Schlip, schlip, thump. It was the sound of a stamp hitting paper. But it didn't sound like office equipment. It sounded like a butcher's cleaver hitting a slab of cold, wet marble. Each thump sent a physical shudder through the floor, a vibration that traveled up through the soles of my shoes, through my shins, and rattled the small, delicate bones in my inner ear. It was the sound of finality. I looked at the man in the charcoal suit again. I needed to see that bead of sweat. I needed to know if gravity still held any authority in this place. The bead was gone. But it hadn't fallen. It had dried, leaving behind a tiny, crystalline crust of salt on his skin, like a microscopic barnacle. And his suit. I leaned in closer, my breath hitching in a throat that felt like it was lined with sandpaper. The charcoal wool was no longer just dusty. A fine, gray powder, much like the ash from a cigar, had settled into the very fibers of his shoulders. It wasn't sitting on top of the fabric. It was merging with it, turning the wool into something resembling soft stone. Then I saw his shoes. The layer of thin, gray moss I had noticed earlier had thickened. It was no longer just a dusting of green. It had become a dense, velvety carpet that had climbed over his laces and was now beginning to weave itself into the hem of his trousers. It looked like a biological weld, a silent, organic glue fusing him to the floor. I looked down at my own feet. The moss was there. It was a pale, sickly silver, reaching out from the cracks in the marble like the cilia of some deep-sea creature. It had already touched the edges of my polished leather soles. I tried to wiggle my toes, and I felt a resistance that wasn't just physical. It was as if the floor had become a powerful magnet and my feet were made of heavy iron. "This is just an illusion," I whispered. My voice was no longer my own. It was a dry, papery sound, stripped of its resonance, like two sheets of parchment rubbing together. "I am dehydrated. I am experiencing a sensory deprivation episode. I just need to move. One step. Just one." I tried to lift my right foot. I put all my strength into it, my face contorting with the effort. I felt the muscles in my thigh tighten and burn. My knee gave a loud, sickening crack that echoed through the lobby like a gunshot. 42 people did not move. Not a single head turned. But the air in the room seemed to grow thicker, colder, and more stagnant, as if the ministry itself were tightening its grip in response to my struggle. The process. The voice didn't come from a person's mouth. It seemed to vibrate directly out of the chest of the man in front of me, though his jaw remained locked tight. "Is the anchor. To move is to drift. To drift is to be forgotten." I stopped fighting. The pain in my leg subsided into a dull, throbbing hum that felt oddly pleasant, like the warmth of a healing wound. I let my foot settle back into the moss. The relief was instantaneous. It was the terrifying relief of surrendering to a current. I looked at my watch. 10:18 a.m. Only 1 minute. I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in my chest, but it died before it reached my throat. My throat was too dry. It felt as though I had been swallowing dry earth for a century. I began to think about my past. I tried to conjure the image of my wife's face. I knew her name, Sarah. I knew we had been married for 12 years. I remembered the day we bought our house. But when I tried to visualize the color of her eyes, they were blurred, replaced by the flickering green light of the next customer sign. I tried to remember my home address, but the numbers scrambled themselves in my mind like a broken code. I was losing the before. My memories were being overwritten by the silence of the lobby. Every thump of the stamp from behind the glass felt like a nail being driven into a coffin. It was the sound of a life being summarized, simplified, and filed away. I began to wonder, if I stayed here long enough, would I eventually see my own name on a sheet of paper? Would I see the summary of a life that felt more like a dream with every passing second? I looked at my tan briefcase. It was sitting on the floor beside me. The leather looked parched, cracking into patterns that mirrored the fissures in the marble floor. I didn't want to open it. I was afraid that if I did, I would find it empty. Or worse, filled with the same gray ash that was settling on my shoulders. Schlip, schlip, thump. The line moved. It wasn't a step. It was a collective, mechanical lurch. The woman in the floral dress at the front had been absorbed by the darkness behind the window, and now the next person was sliding into her place. I moved forward 18 inches. My roots tore from the marble with a sound like 1,000 tiny teeth snapping. I felt a jolt of cold electricity shoot up my spine. It didn't hurt. It felt like being plugged into a circuit. I was now 41st in line. I felt a surge of grim, dark triumph. I was making progress. I was 18 inches closer to the window. I was 18 inches closer to the truth. I looked at the grandfather clock. The pendulum was barely moving now, swinging through the air as if the atmosphere had turned to solid lead. Talk. I waited for the talk. I waited for a lifetime. The lurch of the line had settled, but the vibration of that 18-inch movement remained in my bones, a hum that refused to subside. It rose from my heels to my knees, from my knees to my spine, settling into the base of my skull like a low-voltage current. I stood there, staring at the back of the charcoal suit, and within me, a cathedral of justifications began to rise. Why am I still here? The question was a flickering candle in a vast, dark hall. It flared briefly and was instantly swallowed by the dense, gray shadows of the ministry. I risked one more glance at the doors. The blurry, golden patches of the outside world were still there, but they seemed thinned out, two-dimensional, like a poorly painted backdrop in a theater I had already left. If I walked out now, would I even be able to breathe that air? It seemed too light, too fast, too chaotic. My lungs had grown accustomed to this heavy, sedimentary atmosphere. I had become like a deep-sea creature that would be torn apart by the pressure if brought too quickly to the surface. And then there was the matter of the investment, the trap of sunk costs. I looked at my watch. It still said 10:18 a.m., but my mind screamed that years had passed. If I left now, what would happen to those years? They would remain locked in this room, orphaned. If I stepped through that threshold, I would be walking out with nothing. I would be a man who had stood in a room for 3 minutes and lost his soul. But if I stayed, if I reached the window, that time would be validated. It would be accounted for. The stamp would make the weight real. It would turn the void into a document. It's a test, I whispered to myself, my thoughts spinning in a tight, frantic circle. The ministry doesn't grant permits lightly. They want to see who is worthy of the record. Only those with the iron will to endure the stillness are allowed to pass into the permanent. I began to feel a strange, cold contempt for the world outside. Those people running for taxis, checking notifications, worrying about lunch, they were shallow. They were flickering shadows. They lived in the now, a frantic, unstable spark. But here, in the line, we lived in the always. We were the architects of the permanent. We were the ones who did not change. I looked at my hands, resting on the handle of my briefcase. The gray moss had climbed over my knuckles now. It felt soft, like a velvet glove, and, strangest of all, it was warm. I realized that the cold I had felt earlier was gone. The ministry was insulating me. It was protecting me from the chaotic, burning friction of life. Sarah, I thought. The name felt like a piece of dried fruit in my mouth. Familiar, but devoid of juice. I tried to remember why that name was important. She'll be waiting. She'll wonder where I am. But then a counter-thought arrived, smooth and oily. Will she? In her world, only 3 minutes have passed. To her, I am just a man who walked into a building. If I leave now, I am just a failure who couldn't finish an errand. But if I stay, if I become part of the archive, I will be eternal. She will eventually come here too. Everyone comes here. I've just taken my place early. The logic was flawless. It was a closed loop, a serpent biting its own tail. I began to hallucinate, or perhaps, for the first time, I was seeing clearly. I looked at the marble pillars and saw names carved into the stone. Not names of builders, but names of people like me. Elias Thorne, 1924, waiting. Martha Vance, 1888, waiting. The line wasn't just 42 people deep. It was miles deep. It stretched back through the centuries, a human chain holding up the very ceiling of the world. We were the weight that kept the earth from spinning off its axis from its own madness. Schlip, schlip, thump. The sound from the window was no longer a threat. It was an invitation. I looked at the back of the man's neck. The salt crystal from his dried sweat was glowing with a faint, bioluminescent light. It was beautiful. I felt a sudden, intense desire to reach out and touch it, to join my hand to his neck and complete the circuit. To become part of something larger than myself. Just stay, the radiator hissed. Just wait, the clock groaned. I felt a tear form in my eye. It was thick, like oil. It rolled down my cheek with agonizing slowness, taking an hour to reach my chin. When it finally fell, it didn't splash. It hit the marble with a soft metallic clink, turning instantly into a small, gray pearl. I was no longer a person. I was a process, and the process was right. The silence of the ministry was suddenly punctured by a sound that should have been a herald of salvation, but instead felt like a violent tear in a beautiful shroud. The heavy, iron filigreed doors behind me groaned. A gust of wind, real, turbulent, chaotic wind, rushed into the lobby. It carried the scent of rain on hot pavement and the distant, tinny screech of a subway train braking. For a heartbeat, the golden light from the street flooded the gray haze, making the marble pillars look vulgar and exposed. A man stumbled in. He was young, perhaps in his early 20s, wearing a bright red windbreaker that looked like a scream in a monastery. He was panting, his chest heaving with the exertion of a world that still required breath. He didn't look at the line. He didn't see the moss or the ash. "Is this the place for permits?" he shouted. His voice was a blunt instrument, shattering the pressurized stillness. No one answered. The 41 statues ahead of me remained fixed. I felt the vibration of his voice hit my back like a physical blow. It felt shallow. It felt thin. I looked down at the gray pearl my tear had formed on the floor, and then at the boy's muddy sneakers. He was tracking filth onto the sacred, silent map of our progress. "Hey!" he called out again, stepping closer to me. "Is the computer down or something? Why isn't anyone moving?" He reached out. I felt his hand brush against the sleeve of my coat. His touch was terrifying. He was hot. His skin radiated a frantic, buzzing warmth that felt like a fever. To me, he felt like a sun-going supernova, a dangerous, unstable energy that threatened to melt the cool, protective vellum I had worked so hard to grow. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My neck was now a column of calcified salt and memory. But I spoke. My voice didn't come from my throat. It rose from the floorboards, a low, tectonic hum. "The doors are still open," I said. The boy recoiled. I could hear his quick, shallow breaths. "You guys are creeps. This is crazy. I'm out of here." I heard his footsteps, fast, erratic, wasteful, as he turned back toward the entrance. He reached the doors. He paused. Through the blurred periphery of my vision, I saw him standing in the frame of the open door. The city was right there. He could have just stepped out. He should have. But he didn't. He looked back at us. He looked at the vast, echoing height of the ceiling. He looked at the grandfather clock, which had just struck a note so deep it seemed to still the very air in his lungs. I saw his shoulders drop. I saw the frantic rhythm of his breathing begin to slow, falling into sync with the heavy thud of the radiator. "Actually," he muttered, his voice losing its edge, "I've already spent 10 minutes finding this place. I might as well wait a bit. If I leave now, I'll just have to come back tomorrow." He let go of the door. The iron frame swung shut with a finality that felt like the closing of a tomb. The golden light was extinguished. The scent of rain vanished. The lobby returned to its perfect, emerald twilight. The boy took his place behind me, and I felt the line grow by one more link. 43. I felt a surge of profound, dark joy. I had given him the choice, and he had chosen correctly. He had chosen the weight. He had chosen the anchor. I reached out my hand. My fingers were long, gray, and tipped with sharpened points of bone. I didn't need to open my briefcase anymore. I let it slip from my grip. It didn't hit the floor with a thud. It merged with the marble, becoming a permanent extrusion of the landscape. I was no longer 41st. The woman at the front was gone. The man in the charcoal suit was leaning into the window. Schlip, schlip, thump. I felt the vibration in my teeth. It was a beautiful, rhythmic promise. I was next. I was almost home. I closed my eyes and felt the moss wrap itself around my knees in a final, loving embrace. Time no longer measured itself in hours or days. It was measured in the layers of dust that settled on my shoulders, turning the fabric of my coat into something resembling limestone. I no longer felt the weight of my own body. On the contrary, I felt a strange, almost ethereal lightness. It was as if everything unnecessary, water, fat, random thoughts, fears, had boiled away under the emerald hum of the neon sign. All that remained was the essence. A clean, dry page ready for print. The man in the charcoal suit ahead of me was no longer breathing. I knew this because his back, which once rose and fell with the faintest of movements, was now perfectly still. He had become an ideal geometric object. When the neon sign flashed once more, emitting a sharp, electric crackle, he did not take a step. He simply slid into the void of the window, like a drop of thick ink absorbed by porous paper. Without a sound, without a goodbye. Now it was my turn. I glided toward the window. My feet no longer lifted from the floor. I slid, feeling the moss and the fissures in the marble guide me like rails. I stopped before the frosted pane. It was covered in a delicate pattern of frost that seemed to form endless rows of tiny, unreadable text. I could not see who sat behind the glass. There was no face, no eyes. There was only a massive, slow shadow moving in time with the pendulum of the clock. From behind the pane came the scent of ozone and very old books, the kind that hadn't been opened for centuries. From a small opening at the bottom of the window, a hand emerged. It did not look human. The fingers were long and translucent, like glass tubes, and inside them, I could see a black liquid flowing slowly. The hand froze, waiting. I knew what I had to do. I didn't reach into my pockets for a document. I simply placed my palm on the cold surface of the marble counter. The contact was instantaneous. I felt the ink from that other world begin to flow into my veins. It wasn't painful. It was a feeling of ultimate clarity. My entire life, the walks in the rain, the taste of morning coffee, Sarah's face, the smell of a new car, all of it was compressing, turning into short, concise lines. My name, my dates, my errors, all of it was being stripped of emotion, becoming data. Just a record. I watched my hand on the counter turn flat. My skin was becoming dense, yellowish paper. My nails became hard plates, then vanished entirely, merging into the sheet. Schlip, schlip. The sound of preparation. The registrar was raising the strike. In that final moment, I remembered the boy in the red jacket standing behind me. I wanted to turn around and tell him that he had made the right decision. That the world out there was too loud, too chaotic, too temporary. Here, everything was eternal. Here, each of us found our final place. No one was lost here, because everyone was numbered and filed. I felt the heavy brass stamp descend from above. Thump. The impact passed through me, anchoring the truth. In that moment, I ceased to be Elias Thorne. I became a line in an infinite ledger. My thoughts silenced, becoming part of the quiet of this hall. My eyes closed, and the last thing I saw was the emerald light of the sign flickering out, only to spark back to life a second later. Next customer. Nothing changed in the lobby. The clock continued its slow, wooden rhythm. The moss on the floor continued to grow, wrapping around the boy's red windbreaker as he stood motionless, staring into the void I had left behind. His breathing was already quiet and steady. Outside the ministry, the city continued its roar. Cars drove, people hurried, the sun set and rose. It had stopped. The entry was complete. The file was closed, and a peace arrived that made no sense to break.